You're listening to the Fresh Hell podcast. Fresh Hell contains stories of a disturbing and often graphic nature and is intended for a mature audience. Please don't let your kids listen to this, or they might turn out like us.
Hi, I'm Johanna the Austrian.
And I'm Annie the American, and you're listening to Fresh Hell, the most international of all the international podcasts out there. No, I actually have no idea if that's true, but it's what I'm telling you. We are over 4,000 miles or 6,400 kilometers apart, and we have never met in person. And not only do we talk about murder, mystery, and the macabre, cases from all over the world, we've still never met in real life. Not only do we live in 2 countries and 2 continents separated by an entire ocean, each week we meet up online to tell you about something that we find interesting. And then Johanna does some insane hocus pocus because in the end, I really do think it sounds like we're in the same room. I don't know how you do it. It's magic.
Well, we sound almost in the same room.
Almost.
But I don't think we sound like we are on 2 continents. I think we do sound okay-ish.
Yeah, we're not the worst.
One of the things I do like about doing this podcast with you, that came out wrong because there are so many things that I do like.
Just one. There's like 4 things that I can tolerate about this.
One of them is the fact that we learn a lot about our differences, like cultural background and growing up and different food and, just what's different.
Yeah.
What's going on over there.
Because there's so much that's different. Absolutely.
Outside shutters, for example.
Yes, outside. I'm so jealous of your outside shutters. I mean, I have outside shutters, but you'd have to go out, unlatch them, and then close them, and then lock them. They're like old storm shutters. Different purpose. And then obviously there are places now where you have like hurricane shutters. Do you know what I mean? But I don't think it's common anywhere. I wonder if it's becoming more common in the Southwest, but outdoor shutters, in my experience, have never been a thing, and they're so practical.
They're the best. They keep out the heat. They keep out the cold.
Yeah.
Of course, I also do sounded wrong again. I do really love our listeners who support us by listening, rating, reviewing, and by sharing our content. And if you want to hear more about all of that, please wait until the end of the episode, as always, because then we are going to tell you everything you need to know on that topic. Because for now, I would love to hear the rest of the Chowchilla bus kidnapping, and I'm sure I'm not the only one, because you left us with quite a cliffhanger there last week.
Yeah.
Could you just do me and I guess all of our listeners a huge favor and give us the quickest recap of last week's episode, just so that I'm, have everything ready in my weird brain again.
Absolutely, yes. So, it's July 15th, 1976, and school bus driver Ed Ray is bringing home a busload of kids from a summer school program that was led by Chowchilla, California's Dairyland school system. They've spent the morning in classes, and then in the afternoon they went to the community pool and spent all day swimming, and so now they're on their way home at the end of the day. Ed drops off the first few kids, and then pretty soon after, he stops to help what looks like a stranded motorist. It looks like there's a van broken down. And as he opens the door to the bus to ask if they need a tow truck called, armed men board the bus, which is driven by one of the kidnappers, to an area that's impossible to see from the road. The bus is then abandoned, and Ed and the kids, 27 of them in total, are loaded into panel vans with windows that have been totally blacked out, and they're driven around in complete darkness for over 11 hours. Finally, they arrive in what seems like a barren wasteland, and one by one they're taken from the vans, their names and ages are written down on a piece of paper, and a piece of clothing is taken from them as proof of life. They're then forced down a ladder, which goes about 12 feet down into a hole in the ground, and they're now in an old moving truck that's been buried on the property. And while they're relieved to see all of their friends down there, everyone's alive, including Ed, they're terrified when the ladder is pulled up and a heavy metal plate is dropped over the hole, and then they hear the sound of dirt hitting the top of the container they're in, and they realize they're being buried alive.
That's
where we left things last week.
Did they realize right away that it was a moving truck, or did they only do that, realize later?
Yeah,
They realized immediately, okay.
Immediately. I'm not sure if they realized immediately that it was specifically a moving truck, but it was definitely like a vehicle of some kind.
It was a truck, kind of truck, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so now they're underground, they're really in hell. They've eaten all of the food, and the stench is unbearable. Because you remember, I think I did mention last week that where the wheel wells in the truck were, they had sort of removed those and made a makeshift outhouse, just like a box with a hole in it basically to sit on to go to the bathroom. So you can just imagine the smell. And prior to arriving there, driving around in the dark for 11 hours, a lot of the kids had been vomiting. So it's awful. It's really awful down there. They've eaten all the food. It is sweltering hot. They can hear that the fan is sort of starting to slow down a little bit, so that's getting really worrisome. And the shifting dirt on top of the van has it buckling. They've been in there for almost 12 hours. And so Ed and some of the older children, especially 14-year-old Mike Marshall, who was the oldest, and only there because he got in trouble for sneaking a couple of beers. We mentioned that last week. The rest of the kids were between the ages of 5 and 12, but they all decide that if they're going to die in this gross old moving truck, they're going to die trying to escape. Most of the little ones comfort the really little ones. That's the thing that's so hard about this, is they're all children.
Yeah.
And so Ed, our bus driver, I believe he was 55 when this happened, and then Mike Marshall was 14 at the time, and then there were two 11-year-olds, Jeff Brown. He was the little boy who, when the kidnappers first boarded the bus, he thought it was just like an elaborate prank and was like, "We didn't do anything," you know what I mean, as a joke.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And his sister Jennifer was also with him on the bus. They were actually separated and put into different vans, so that whole 11 hours while they were being driven around in those pitch black vans, neither of them had any idea if the other one was alive. And Jennifer talks about crying the entire time for her older brother and that she wanted Jeffy, and it's fucking devastating to listen to. So the bus driver and Mike Marshall and Jeff Brown and Robert Gonzalez, who are both 11, and a few of the older kids, they decide they're getting out. They stack all the mattresses, and there were quite a few of them lining the truck, and they stack them all at one end underneath where the hatch was, Princess and the Pea style, right? And so they're able to get up on top of the mattresses, and once they're up there, they use a piece of wood that I believe was broken off from a box spring that was also in the moving van. And so they used this as leverage to sort of move the plate. And when they did this, some of the earth on top of the plate started to fall in through the hole. And again, the kids were screaming and crying. They thought they were going to die in a cave-in. They thought the whole thing was just going to collapse on them. But amazingly, they managed to clear about a 6-inch space, just big enough for one of the kids to go through. And this took hours and hours and hours. It was not easy. They had to pour water on themselves to fight off the heat stroke.
It's unbelievable how brave they were. I mean, these are children we are talking about, and they really did take the chances. And I guess they also had to really like and trust Ed a lot, because he was the grown-up, the authority figure in there.
Absolutely.
And they trusted him enough to make the decision, okay, we're gonna try to get out of here, right?
That's right. And most of them would have known Ed and each other for their whole lives. Like I said, this was a really small, tight-knit community. You know what I mean? Everybody sort of knew everybody else. And so, yeah, the older boys did a lot of the physical labor, and the older girls did a lot of the emotional labor, taking care of the younger children. 17 of those kids were 10 years old or younger.
So babies.
Yeah, a lot of 5-year-olds and 6-year-olds. And I know that a lot of the stories very specifically mention the boys as being heroes, and absolutely 100% they were. But I think the girls played just as important a role by keeping the others calm and taking care of the true babies on that bus. I don't want to dismiss the role that they played in everyone's survival, because if all the little ones had been in absolute chaos, they would never have been able to get the job done. You know what I mean? It really took everybody.
I think everybody just really did what needed to be done.
Exactly.
And everybody played an important role.
Exactly. There. Exactly the point. Yeah. So finally, a very exhausted Mike squeezes through the 6-inch space. And once he's out, he's still not out. He's now in a box that's covering the hole. And so he has to sort of dig his way out of that too. Best I can figure it, sort of what they had done, if you can kind of imagine it, is imagine the back like of a container truck is buried underground. And then they've cut a hatch, a hole, where you can get into it through that ladder, right? But then they put a steel plate on top of that. And then on top of that, they put a big box, just like a wooden box, covering the entire steel plate so that nobody would see the steel plate and say, why is there a steel plate there? Do you know what I mean? So I think it was made to just look like a shipping container. And so he had to sort of get out of that as well. And while he's doing all of this, he is pretty sure that he's going to find guns pointed at his face when he finally makes it out, but he just kept going. And he emerges from the hole and he looks around and has absolutely no idea where he is, but he is able to move that steel plate off the opening of the roof of the van. And suddenly, down in that filthy, stinking, hot, miserable hole they're in, there was just a ray of light and some fresh air, and they knew Mike had done it. He got the space big enough for everyone to be able to get out, and they got out of that hole around 8 p.m. the following day, July 16th. So now they're out, but they have no idea where they were, and they didn't know where the kidnappers were, or if they were watching, or when they'd be back, right? But they hear a noise, and so they make their way to where they hear a sound, and they come across, I think it was just a couple of night shift quarry workers, who must have been absolutely gobsmacked, just stunned to see all of these children. And the quarry worker they saw apparently said, the whole world's been looking for you.
I mean, can you even imagine?
It would be like if Amelia Earhart landed in my backyard right now.
Yeah.
You know who they didn't see? Was Mike. Apparently, once they got out and he got everybody out, he still didn't feel like things were safe. So when they took off for the sounds that they were hearing, he actually went the other way and hid because he wanted to make sure that if they were all about to be captured again, he could still get away and get help. And he stayed hidden until police arrived.
Smart boy. Very smart boy. Okay, so where exactly were they?
They were in Livermore, California, at a rock quarry. It's about 50 miles or so from San Francisco and only about 100 miles or 160 kilometers from Chowchilla. One of the kids said it looked like the Flintstones, which is like, oh, with all the conveyor belts, you know. The way they describe things, it just really hammers home how little they were. Do you know what I mean? It was like, we got out and I thought we were in the Flintstones. It's like...
And there was the Easter Bunny.
Yeah, kills me. So it wasn't really that far from where they had been taken, but the kidnappers had driven the kids around for over 11 hours, waiting for the employees of the quarry to all go home. Right? Because they couldn't show up in vans full of children with a bunch of people there. They had spent a lot of time in that quarry, so much so that they had buried an entire moving van there. So the police arrive, and once that happens, Mike relaxes and he comes out of hiding. And, okay, so just keep in mind for the next bit, that was a different time. So the police find them. I think they do send word to the parents to let them know they've been found and they're all safe. And then the kids are put back on a bus and taken to the local jail. So the Santa Rita Detention Center was the closest place that could hold everyone. It's not like they were all brought into an interrogation room or anything. You know, they weren't. I think there were just conference spaces or something. It was just big enough for everybody. But I did see something where one of the kids said they saw the jail and thought they were being punished for escaping.
Oh, poor babies. Yeah, it's different times, and I don't mean because they brought them to the detention center, even though a hospital might have been more what's needed at that point.
And they made them get back on a bus.
Yeah, and there probably wasn't much of an expert for psychological trauma on hand.
No.
I mean...
Nope. But they did have very caring nurses. and police officers around them. And so they got cleaned up a little bit, and they were given food and drinks and checked out and found to be in really pretty good shape considering what they'd been through. Some of them needed clean jumpsuits, including Ray. They had taken his pants and shoes. And then before they got to see their families, they were then questioned for several hours. And then when that was done, they were put on another bus. I know. I kept thinking of, it's so bad. I'm obviously in no way making fun of these kids' trauma, but it just made me think of that scene in Jurassic Park where the truck falls after the T-Rex has been chasing them, and the truck falls through the trees and lands on the little boy, and he goes through the skylight so he's not hurt when the truck falls on him. And he's like, well, we're back in the truck again. That's all I can think of. It's like, oh, well, we're back on a bus again. These poor kids just, all right. One of the things I came across in my research was a message board, and it had a lot of messages from people who were directly involved. And so I just wanted to read you one because I thought this was so nice. This was posted it's a 2009 post by Bill the nurse, and he wrote, quote, I was one of the 2 nurses that cared for the kids while they were at Santa Rita Correctional Facility. I also rode on the Greyhound bus with them back to Chowchilla. Went through the court process as a witness also. Anyway, I will never forget. A permanent memory for me. I still keep drawings, letters, and such the kids gave me that night and that they sent to me for months, years afterward. Hello to any of them that read this note. Nurse Bill.
That's nice.
Isn't that nice?
Yeah.
And then Jennifer Brown, she was the little girl who was separated from her brother Jeffrey. She wrote a response to him, and she also was writing a response to another friend of hers from childhood who had made a separate post saying that he realized he had one of her books if she should happen to read this, message, and he'd like to return it if she wants it back. And so then Jennifer responded, and this is actually in 2010 that she responded, and she wrote, quote, what a surprise to read these postings from people I actually know. I was online looking up details of the kidnapping to answer some questions someone asked me about the timeline of the kidnapping. After 30-plus years, I could not remember exactly some of the details. Over the years, I've stashed some of those parts of my life in storage in the back depths of my brain. Yeah, I get that. Felix, keep the book. I didn't realize you still had it. Thanks for thinking of returning the book. You're a very thoughtful person to do so. I have fond memories of the time spent with you. Hope life is treating you well. To Nurse Bill, I will never forget the kindness you and Nurse Dave showed to me during the ordeal. I still have photos of you from the parade you attended shortly after the kidnapping. I'm now married 15 years with 2 boys living in a southern state. Many people cross your path in life and help make you the person you are today. You two, Felix and Bill, have been a stepping stone in my life to happiness, love, and peace. Hope you found the same. End quote. I just thought that was nice. And a lot of them are still in contact together. A lot of the kidnapping victims are all still close. So the bus carrying the kidnapping victims gets back into Chowchilla at 4 a.m., 36 hours after they were kidnapped, and elated families are there waiting along with the news crews. There's lots of photos of, there's one that just kills me, one with a father holding his daughter who's like openly sobbing, and it's, very emotional reunion.
And I'm sure at that point they never wanted to board another bus ever again. Obviously, they had psychological trauma, but other than that, children and Ed, they were all physically okay.
Yeah, they were. And also, I'm sorry if you hear Opus outside. He's a little woofy today. But yes, physically, for the most part, there were very little damage. A lot of them were probably dehydrated. I know there were some scrapes and bruises, but physically, there was really nothing serious at all. Psychologically, well, don't worry. They'll be fine. They've been rescued, it's sorted out, and they're all going to Disneyland, right? So, yeah, it's going to be fine. Because, of course, immediately having wonderful positive experiences will wipe away all of the very intense psychological trauma you just experienced. But to be fair, look, everybody was doing the best they could at the time. It's just that Disneyland isn't going to cure your PTSD. I'm trying to think how many, dark rides there are there, actually, so maybe it really wasn't the best choice.
True.
There's no amount of bibbity-bobbity bullshit to make this better. Do you know what I mean? It's just, oh, these poor kids, they are really going to have to do a lot of, I don't even know what the word is, emotional healing from that sort of trauma.
It's going to need a lot to work that through.
Oh, yeah. And we'll talk a little bit more about that at the end. But now it's time to talk about our kidnappers, because this is not unsolved. We know who they are. One of the first things that the police realized was that the way this entire fucking moving truck had been buried in the quarry, it had to have been done by somebody with access to the quarry, right? Like someone with keys to the gate. So they look into that lead.
I mean, of course, you need time and equipment to do something like that.
Yeah.
You just don't show up at a quarry and bury a moving van and that's it, if you don't have connections there.
Exactly. And in the meantime, Edward agreed to be hypnotized to see if it might help, and it actually does. He remembers the license plate of the van that had pretended to be broken down. I thought that was pretty cool. As for our kidnappers, well, the last time we talked about them, they had been trying to get in touch with the police with their ransom demands, but couldn't get through because of all the media, and so they take a nap, and when they wake up, they see all over the news that the children had escaped. All of their work, all of their careful planning, it was all for nothing.
Yeah, I'm sorry that I'm laughing because actually I feel so bad for them. Not really. I would have loved to see their faces though. That must have been priceless. I still don't get what their plans were exactly. Like, to put it in your words, Annie, who are these people?
All right. Let me tell you about these losers, these no-good nicks, these miscreants. Now I want to put it in your words, but I can't remember. It's not good for nothing.
Do no goods. Tu nicht gut.
Do no goods. What is it in German again?
Tu nicht gut.
Tu nicht gut. Yeah, that's the one. So the kidnappers are 3 young men, all in their early 20s, all from very wealthy, privileged families in the San Francisco Bay Area. So more specifically, they were from the Portola Valley, which I had never heard of, and Atherton, which also didn't ring a bell for this East Coast girl. So I looked Atherton up, and it is apparently always in the top 3 zip codes in the United States in terms of wealth. The median income is almost $500,000. So the average income is $500,000. This place is richy rich. Like Carlton Banks would be impressed by this zip code. I'm curious, though, for our California listeners, do you guys really talk about zip codes, or did 90210 give us a false sense of California in the same way the rest of the world thinks that the TV show Cops is like our everyday reality and we're all just out here doing our best trying to survive the purge? Anyway. The ringleader was Frederick Newhall Woods IV, and if his middle and last name sound familiar, he was the 24-year-old son of a couple from 2 prominent families. His family was very wealthy, with lots of assets, and one of those assets was the quarry in Livermore, where the truck had been buried.
They're not criminal masterminds, thank God.
These 2? No. Nope. Just wait. This is great. Because I'm not laughing at anything that happened to the children, but I will laugh at how ridiculous these no-good nothings really were. All right, so Fred Woods, his family estate is Hawthorne, and you know I looked it up. So it's 78 acres, or around 315,655 square meters. That's how you do land, right? Did I look that up right?
That should be about right, yeah, because I think we have half an acre.
Okay.
So that would make sense, yeah.
Yeah. It's huge. It's a really big plot of land. Really big. And on this huge plot of land, his parents had a home, as did his grandmother, and he lives in what the papers called a converted outbuilding. I'm pretty sure that it's, we post what I call house porn, although we have to change that, don't we? Did Facebook just flag us for using the term porn?
It flagged me.
For saying house porn.
And then they said that it's going to be reported to the administrators, which is also me. Everything I did was share an article from an Austrian newspaper about the Manna Mansion in Vienna. Well, I disputed it and never heard back from them.
No, you won't. They'll ghost you. But you know how I love these old buildings. And so we're always sharing pictures of old buildings. And so he lived in a converted outbuilding, but I'm imagining it's like one of those things where, it's like the 4-car garage or it's the stables. And then up above is this stunning. That's where I think he was living. I don't think he was living in like where I was living right after in college, which was like an apartment over a garage where you could see through the floors.
Did you ever watch The OC?
No.
And that's about this kid, Ryan, who ends up living with a lawyer and his family in Orange County. And he lives in the pool house then. They adopt him. And I mean, that's not too shabby.
Right, like the Gilmore Girls pool house. Isn't there a pool house there too? But yeah, it was all very nice. And I have a link about the estate, which was apparently gifted to the Mid-Peninsula Regional Open Space District in 2011. So it was basically donated as green space to the area, which is, I'm kind of curious as to why that was done. It was probably to avoid tax implications because that would have been a lot of money. Like land there would have been worth a lot of money. Do you know what I mean? That's a lot of land to donate. And his estate doesn't seem like our kidnapper does anything if it doesn't benefit him. Do you know what I mean? I'm just curious what the reasoning for that was. Yeah. Oh, if it makes you feel better, I did read his estate sold one of their mansions on Martha's Vineyard, but they sold it right before everything doubled in price. So, if we're going to be petty about things. Yeah, so the law heads out to the family estate and they're searching the mansion and they find one of the guns that was used in the shooting. So that's great. But you know what's even better? The plan for the entire thing written out in longhand.
Wow.
Yeah, I have a photograph of the plan. I will share it in the Facebook group. Johanna, I sent a copy for you to look at.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't have access to our Facebook group, it's literally like it's like a 3-ring hole punch. So there's hole punches on the side and it's just lined school paper. And and it says at the top, plan. And then underneath it says, getta, and that's crossed out. And then it just says, stop a bus, transfer the occupants, put occupants to sleep, take occupants to hideout, lock them in. And then on the right, they've got some things that are like, what's wrong? And it's things that could go wrong. And it's like somebody witnesses it, somebody does this, and they just keep writing, hope for the best, hope for the best, hope for the best.
Who wrote that plan? Like Kevin McAllister?
I know. And then the next section is ransom. They have ransom with an E. Take clothes and leave in suitcases. Police find clothes and instructions. Police follows instructions with certain precautions. Occupants returned unharmed. Investigation. So now there's a list of things the police will be able to find out immediately, right? Because they put everything in their own name. So it's like the moving van used, the wire fencing used, the welder, the Dodge van, all of these things that they know. They haven't tried to hide it, And it's so funny to me because down the whole way, that right side of the page, it's like, what could be wrong? What's wrong? What's wrong? And for the most part, well, in one it says, must be according to plan and must be fast, hope for the best. And then hope for the best just shows up over and over and over again. And it just amuses me a little because I used to make charts like this as an event planner, not for kidnappings, but for fundraisers. And just to be clear, it's important to make that clear. And like if it rains, be sure valet parking people have umbrella, having placed indoors set up for ladies to change into appropriate footwear, that kind of thing. But never, ever did I just write hope for the best, with exception of weather, right? Because what else are you going to do but hope for the best? Considering how long it took them to plan things, over a year, they made a lot of mistakes.
Considering they held the life of 27 people in their stupid hands, hope for the best is definitely gonna cut it. It's not good enough a plan, honestly.
Right. Now, to be fair, in addition to hope for the best, you're also gonna see don't lose your cool. Repeated very oftenly.
So what was the plan when they were about to lose their cool? They're gonna pull out their legal pad paper and look at it and then remember they shouldn't lose their cool?
No, that's when you hope for the best. If you do lose your cool, you just hope for the best. It's not the worst life motto, though. Like, hope for the best and don't lose your cool. It's like the 70s American hippie version of keep calm and carry on. Like, just hope for the best and don't lose your cool. I think I want that on a bumper sticker now. But yeah, I don't know. Maybe when you're orchestrating a crime, all of your backup plans shouldn't be hope for the best. But it's a good thing for us that they were, because all this stuff the police know and more, they know it all because they bought all this shit. They didn't even try to hide a paper trail. Like, the vans were registered in their names. The guns were registered in their names. They were buried in Fred's daddy's quarry in a moving truck that he bought. It was in his name. That's the other thing that's hard to work out, like how I think they just didn't think there'd be consequences. Okay, so let's talk about the other two people involved, and these were the brothers, James Schoenfeld, who was 24, and James's younger brother, Richard. I'm not sure if it's Schoenfeld or Schoenfeld. Watch, it's probably something completely different. But James and Richard, they were 24 and 22 respectively. Their dad was a prominent podiatrist in the area, and they also grew up in an affluent town wanting for nothing. And I really mean nothing, because in their case, I think they had a very close and loving family. You know what I mean? And they were very wealthy, and they just had everything. I think they got in with Fred Woods, who was he was a problem. And so the police know all three of these cretins. They had previously faced charges of grand theft auto, but gotten probation. Wayne King, in a July 26, 1976 special to the New York Times, writes, quote, "The two Schoenfeld brothers and Mr. Woods were arrested in October 1974 after they were seen pushing a car off a road near the town of Downeyville, northeast of San Francisco. Originally, the three were charged with joyriding, a felony, but the charges were later reduced to petty theft and finally to auto tampering, a misdemeanor. They pleaded guilty, were fined $125 each, and placed on a year's probation. District Attorney Warren Haas said, quote, "It was a minor matter. We had no reason to expect to see them again. They were good kids," end quote.
All I hear is bored, privileged kids, Leopold and Loeb style, for example.
Yeah, such good kids. Really. Just such good kids. I do think Fred was probably a bad friend for them to have had. Maybe if they'd never met him, their life would have gone a different way. I think that's the case for a lot of people who end up in these sort of situations, right?
Sure, but they were grown-ups and made a decision. They could always make their own decisions. It's not like they were forced. It's not like, as far as I understand, it's not like they were incapable of deciding things. I mean...
No, that's right.
Their own responsibility.
I think that Richard, who was the youngest of the two brothers, I think he kind of was going along with a lot of stuff. I don't think he ever thought anything would ever happen. I think in his mind, for a long time, he really thought that this was something they were doing for fun. Do you know what I mean? Like, well, if we were going to do this, this is how we do it. Do you know what I mean? And
it's this kind of, how would you get rid of a body? Hypothetically.
Yes, we kind of do this stuff all the time.
Yeah.
And I think there was also talk about one of their other friends was actually a writer, like wanted to do screenplay writing. So I think it's possible there might have been an element initially of thinking like, what if we were going to write a movie? How would you do it? What, you know, that kind of sort of thing. But at some point, you had to have recognized that once you were burying a truck or buying anything, I don't know. It seems that these young men had been under increasing pressure from their parents to just get their shit together and get real jobs rather than repeatedly. It seems like they were constantly trying to do these like get-rich-quick schemes and business plans that never worked out. You know, like the type of people where honest work is just a complete anathema. They just go from one failed project to another, with mommy and daddy picking up the pieces as they sort of drift hopelessly through life. And they found themselves in debt again. And they were embarrassed. They didn't want to go back to their parents and ask to be bailed out again. And so their solution was to kidnap a whole bunch of people, making it worth the $5 million ransom, which is what they were planning to ask for. So they figured out a way to get the kids, stash the victims, collect the ransom, and then eventually free the unarmed hostages. And I think the three of them, along with their friend who was that screenwriter, they did sort of plan it out for over a year, but I also don't understand how they never, in any of that years plus of planning, they just never thought that their plan would be found out. Do you know what I mean? Like, how did you... They hid nothing. Like,
no plan B, C, D, nothing. Yeah.
Well, yeah, and just not even, like, they use credit cards to buy. Like, there was a deep paper trail following them, tying them to everything, and that's what's weird. So police find the plan. They find a ransom note. I'll post that too. And then we find some of the plans they didn't have a chance to implement. Like, so the way they wanted to receive the money was they wanted it to be dropped from a plane in a case that wouldn't break on impact. And it's like the plane should be flying at no higher an altitude than this and no faster speed, and you need to draw. It's like this insane.
It's like a kid. It's like a kid who imagines doing something like that.
Yes, exactly. Oh, and you're going to love this. They wanted to be known as Beelzebub. And you bet your ass I looked up when Queen's Bohemian Rhapsody was released, and it was in October of 75, around the time they would have started to plan all of this ridiculousness. All right, so now Richard is the younger brother. He turns himself in 8 days later before he could be arrested. Like, I think he was literally, arrest was imminent. And he was like, I'm sorry, I'm coming in, we did it, I confess.
But also sounds kind of maybe he was relieved, I don't know.
Very much so, yeah. Yeah, I think he was very glad to be done of it and was genuinely sorry about what had happened. But his older brother James and Fred, they took off. They were both caught pretty quickly. Fred had eventually made it into Canada, but he even fucked that up. Okay, so here's what happened. The first time he went to Canada, he arrives at the border and he's like, oh, hi. You know, and of course, the border's like, what are you here for? And he says, I'm visiting a friend to go to the Olympics. But Border Patrol takes a look at him, and they didn't think he looked like he had enough money on him to stay with friends and go to the Olympics. And so they denied him entry, Pretty Woman style. They were like, I don't think so. Sorry. And so they turned around and he went back. And so then he tried a second time, and this time Border Patrol actually searched his vehicle, and they found a gun that he didn't realize was in the car.
Jesus.
And he was denied entry again. And so once again, he got a sorry and had to go back the other way. At this point, I think he was being followed, so he went and he sold the guns that he had. But the third time was a charm. I didn't write the exact info down. It just occurred to me that you might find it funny how he even bungled the border crossing several times. He's just done nothing right. And he is also arrested before the end of the month. There's an article from October 1st, 1976 in the Oakland Tribune by Lloyd Bowles, and he writes that, quote, investigators estimated that $10,000 had been spent on the preliminary preparation for the kidnapping. They continue with a quote I'm rather fond of in regards to these kidnappers, but did those charged with the offense have the brains to plan it? Authorities don't think so. Quote, Woods, from what we've been able to determine, is 2 quarts low, if you know what I mean, end quote. And one investigator added that Richard Schoenfeld is too timid and lacks the street smarts to be anything but a follower, end quote. In July 1977, all 3 pled guilty to 27 charges of kidnapping, and they were sentenced to life in prison without the chance for parole. There's more to that, but I wanted to tell you a little bit about Sheriff Bates, who was the one who sort of oversaw the investigation and all of that. And I just thought this was lovely. So there's a story about him in an online article for the Madera Tribune, and it's uncredited, but it was written in 2020 about the sheriff's upcoming 95th birthday. And I read 2 interesting facts about him. We talked a little about the school bus driver last week, and I just wanted to tell you a little bit about the sheriff this week. And here they are. So this is a quote from that article from the Madera Tribune, which we'll link to, of course, in our sources. Quote, on the day they brought the 3 kidnappers to Chowchilla for the arraignment, Bates was approached by a couple of area farmers who asked, quote, Ed, what would you do if we took these guys away from you and hanged them? I'd kill you, the sheriff replied. You mean you would actually shoot us? Asked the local man. That's exactly what I would do, said Bates. That was almost 44 years ago, and Bates was then 51 years old. On Election Day, November 3rd, 2020, Madera County's Wild West Sheriff will celebrate his 95th birthday. End quote.
Is this a direct quote from Deadwood?
Yeah, right? You didn't want to fuck around with Sheriff Bates. Like, at all. But then the second story from the same article goes like this, and I just love this story so much that I had to share, and also we need to give his wife some credit. So it starts with about how the Sheriff Bates had faked his age to fight in the Second World War. He was only 16 years old and lied and said he was legally old enough. But then it goes on to say, quote, toward the end of his hitch, Bates met someone who would be his companion forever, Frida June Ball. Frida was a corporal in the U.S. Marines working in Washington, D.C., while Bates was in the Far East performing intelligence duty. After the defeat of Japan, he returned to Washington and Frida, and they decided to get married. On March 9, 1946, the recently discharged Marine and sailor became husband and wife in a ceremony in Modesto. Frida became Bates's lifetime companion in every sense of the word. Not only were they married, she was his professional partner. When Ed became sheriff, he made Frida his personal assistant at no cost to the county. Frida worked side by side with her husband throughout his 2 terms as Madera County Sheriff. She rode with him on patrol, she went with him on investigations, she tended to important paperwork duties, and she never received a penny for her years of service. End quote. So, I don't know. I just thought those stories, while very different, really helped me to understand what kind of person their sheriff is. It seems like they chose well. Frida passed away in 2003, surrounded by her family. She and Sheriff Bates were married for 57 years. I believe that Sheriff Bates is still alive, and I hope well. So, meanwhile, after the Disney trip, which Mike Mitchell skipped in favor of heading out of town with the rodeo for a while, the town still wasn't done celebrating the fact that no one had died.
I'd say that's a freaking miracle now that I know what imbeciles were responsible for this absolutely amazing plan. But it's also due to the kids and Edward being extremely courageous and strong. Like, I'm still baffled by that. That they just... Yeah, I mean, if that's a group of grown-ups and they decide to make a run for it and try to get out of there, okay. But kids, little kids, tiny kids.
It's amazing. It really is. And there's an article in The Independent, which is a paper from Long Beach, California, from July 31st, 1976. And in it, there is a photograph of Ed Ray, and he is shaking the hand of a gentleman who is handing over a CB radio. The description underneath explains that Larry... I'm going to say his last name is Cranes, Krains. He's the president of Crayco Enterprises in Compton, and he has given the school 24 CB radios and antennas so they can be installed in the school buses so that drivers would never be completely isolated on their daily runs, which is awesome. On August 22nd, 1976, Chowchilla celebrated Ed Ray and Children's Day, which had a parade and speeches and a barbecue. You remember Jennifer talking about seeing the nurses at the parade? That was the Ed and Children's Day. And a lot of them were feeling safer, knowing that the men who had buried them alive would spend the rest of their lives in prison. But of course, it doesn't work out that way. So the kidnappers' families were very wealthy and had the money to appeal the decision. Part of the reason they got life with no parole was because of the bodily harm that was done to Edward and the kids. But the 3 refused to plead guilty to harming anyone, and a judge actually agreed. And so in 1980, life in prison without the possibility of parole was reversed, and it was decided that they would in fact be eligible for parole.
And let me guess, they were of course granted parole at some time, because coming from over here, nothing can surprise me when it comes to prison sentences.
Yeah. Well, the Schoenfeld brothers have both been released. Richard, the younger, who turned himself in, he was paroled in 2012. His brother James was released in 2015. Also, I feel like sometimes I swap the brothers' names around, so if I've done that, I'm sorry. But yeah, they were both released because they both had good behavior. Richard got out sooner because he was really more of a follower. He was the one that immediately turned himself in. Well, not immediately, but 8 days later turned himself in, whereas his older brother had really taken off. And Richard also never thought they'd go through with it, and he also expressed genuine remorse. And so James served more time because he ran he didn't turn himself in. He served more time. And then he was asked why he had done it at a press conference when he was released, and his response was apparently that he and Fred were in a lot of debt despite their wealthy families, and he said, quote, "We needed multiple victims to get multiple millions, and we picked children because children are precious. The state would be willing to pay ransom for them, and they don't fight back. They're vulnerable. They will mind." End quote. When he says they will mind, he means children will obey. That's like an older fashioned. I'm not sure how many people would be familiar with that phrase. You know what I mean? You probably know like mind your manners, but behave. But yeah, at least both of the Schoenfeld brothers seem to be genuinely remorseful and have apologized publicly. I think they have also reached out and spoken to some of the survivors and apologized. The biggest issue with parole was how often the victims had to go to court and look at the men who kidnapped them and then testify to their trauma over and over and over again, just dozens of times. In a recent local piece for the Fresno ABC affiliate, Brendan Beal and Justin Mendoza write, quote, "At Wood's parole hearing in 2012, victim Jennifer Brown, you remember she was the one from the message board, she gave a heartbreaking account of what life had been like for the kidnapping victims. Quote, I wrote that they buried me alive. They stole my childhood and caused me immense emotional pain over the years. It affected my life, my parents' lives, and my children's lives, she said. For me, it's like having to deal with hatred and anger toward other human beings, and that's a struggle that almost 40 years later I still have to deal with. Until recently, I slept with a nightlight. I have anxiety attacks when I'm in a confined space, she revealed. I'm fortunate I'm not incarcerated or hooked on drugs, which is how some of the kids dealt with it. I'm okay as a broken person can be." End quote. So Jennifer and her older brother were both on that bus. You remember they were separated when they were forced into vans. And her brother Jeff would die young in 1981 in an accident that happened on the farm. He was only 15 years old.
It's all just so incredibly sad, and it's so much suffering throughout their lives. They would have to experience so much suffering. And it's infuriating because, of course, that's suffering that none of the kidnappers can't even begin to grasp at all. Like Fred, who's still in prison. I'm sure he even feels sorry for himself. That's always this kind of people.
Oh, yeah. Yep. And he is still in prison. So unlike the Schoenfeld brothers, Fred Woods has never shown any remorse, and he did not demonstrate good behavior while in prison. Let's talk quickly about some of the things that he was getting up to. So he was caught using his cell phone to call a friend and tell him to get started on a screenplay for the movie that they were going to make about the kidnapping and how much money they'd make by doing that. Neither of those things is allowed, and the cell phone thing was a repeated infraction. He was caught with porn repeatedly. He was married and divorced thrice. That's not a crime, but again, I know so many nice single people that have never even once considered burying a bunch of kids alive, right? I don't get it. He bought a multi-million-dollar waterfront mansion, which probably explains at least a few of those marriages, right? He also bought the 2 vans. Oh, this fucker. He bought the 2 vans he used in the kidnapping as an investment because he thought that their association with his notorious crime would make them worth more to a collector. He bought and sold cars, including one, I think it was some fancy Rolls Royce that he sold for over $100,000. He had a Christmas tree farm, and then he got really angry at the man that he had hired to run the Christmas tree farm, and he tried to sue him because all the trees died. But the guy, he was like, fuck you never paid for any water, and you planted trees in the desert.
Wow.
So that went nowhere, but that's how that lawsuit is how they sort of figured out that he was doing these deals in prison, which you have to have permission to do. And then once his parents passed away, he owned all their assets, including the quarry, a gold mine out by Tahoe, all kinds of property. And again, he got found out when someone at the mine sued him for a workman's comp injury. That's how they realized that he was doing all of this behind bars.
Wait. He had all this money. I don't know how it is in the States, but please tell me that he had to pay a certain, I hope a huge sum of money to his victims to, I don't even know how to call it in English, because you know what I mean? I know giving them money wouldn't take away what happened, but they deserve the money. He does not deserve the money.
Oh, yeah. I was surprised to learn that you're actually allowed to run businesses from prison, but yeah, you are. You just need permission, and Fred did not have it. And I agree with the retired sheriff that Fred sounds like a sociopath. The articles you read with people who knew Fred either describe him as very charming or a total loner, which on its own is like, yeah, that's a sociopath. He's never been sorry. He always just looks out for himself. Oh, he was also married for a year and then divorced before any of this even happened, so in his very early 20s. And his ex-wife says that his childhood wasn't that loving. And it's like, yeah, well, a lot of people don't have childhoods that were particularly loving, but they still don't use their millions to torture children, right? In a 2016 article for the Fresno Bee, Rory Appleton writes, quote, although Chowchilla seems poised to move on, a former Madera County sheriff cautioned its residents not to completely forget the past. Ed Bates, so we know about Sheriff Bates, now 91, was the Madera County sheriff from 1970 to 1980. When asked about the case, he focused on the kidnappers. He has long believed the kidnappers attempted to bribe their victims into silence, and he was glad to see Woods remain in prison. Woods is a sociopath, said Bates, who taught criminology at Fresno State for a decade after retiring as Madera's sheriff. All of his waking hours are spent wondering what he can do to get more for himself. Bates said he wasn't upset about the Schoenfelds getting out, but he believes none of the kidnappers should have had a shot at parole. Investigators had originally asked for life without the possibility of parole, but the courts ruled against it. Quote, back then, the courts said that emotional distress could not be measured, he said. Damage to your mental capacity didn't count, but there's no doubt that these kids were injured emotionally, end quote. In the 1970s, some psychiatrists believed that children would suffer no long-term side effects. In fact, they may emerge stronger having survived the challenge. Analysis in the decades since the kidnapping have shown exactly the opposite. All have suffered some sort of emotional stress. End quote.
Of course.
Yeah, you'll find the link to that full article in our sources. It's a good one. And there have been allegations, actually, that the kidnappers' attorneys were offering bribes, were basically offering money to survivors who would then come to the parole hearings and testify in favor of release. I'm not going to get too into that because while I do have more information and I do think it probably happened, I'm not going to point the finger at anyone who may have taken money to testify. It doesn't help anything. All of these people have gone through absolute hell. Do you know what I mean? And all of these people, as it turns out, Disneyland in a parade isn't going to erase the trauma. They suffer from PTSD, they're claustrophobic, many are adults with crippling fear of the dark. There's a piece where one of the kids who was kidnapped now as an adult, his wife says how it's these funny little things. This part actually really hit me. She said she was singing If You're Happy and You Know It to their kid, and he suddenly interrupted her and just said, you know, I'd really appreciate it if I never had to hear that song again. And I've got goosebumps right now. When my late husband was dying, I sang You Are My Sunshine to him because I couldn't think of anything else to say anymore. So I have an issue with that song now. Do you know what I mean? If I hear it, it just takes me right back. But yeah, these kids as adults, like they talk about being damagingly overprotective of their own children. Things like, you know, they'd watch out the window and get their kids, you know, let their kids on the school bus. And then they'd hop in their car and like follow the school bus to the school to make sure the children, you know, like really intense stuff, which 100% you understand. A lot of them had a very hard time with relationships. Some have spent time in prison themselves, often due to crimes where they may have felt the need to control others. Many have written books about their experience. If you do a search, you'll find quite a few books out there. They almost all report nightmares, and far too many of them are familiar with the struggle that comes from self-medicating and that leading to drug and alcohol addiction. So while everybody got out, the kids weren't all right, you know? Edward received a California School Employees Association citation for outstanding community service for his heroics. He retired from bus driving in 1988. Edward Ray died on May 17th, 2012. He was 91 years old and lived to know his children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. He stayed close to many of the children who were with him that day on the bus, and a lot of them had been to visit him again during his final days. He had actually purchased the school bus, which for some reason doesn't creep me out as much as the kidnappers buying the van.
No, that's different. No. Yeah, that's different.
And so he kept it and he held on to it, and eventually it was donated to a local museum. Many of the children who were with him on the bus that day have written messages of love to him on the yellow paint. And you remember that first Ed Ray and Children's Day? Well, they now do that annually on his birthday. And in February of 2015, they officially named the city's largest park after him. One last thing, in 2016, as you were hoping, yes, the 25 kids did sue their kidnappers for emotional distress, and they won. The money came out of Woods' trust fund. We don't know how much it was, though, and it's not enough, because the quote you see repeated is from one survivor who said that they can't disclose the money, but that it was enough to pay for therapy, but not enough to buy a house. Which must be really galling, because they know Woods has bought a mansion from prison. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. In a 2016 article about the lawsuit, Dan Noyes writes, quote, "The kidnappers' attorney declined to be interviewed about the lawsuit, and their only public comment was from an interview more than 20 years ago. Jim Schoenfeld said, quote, 'I'm very sorry, deeply sorry for what I've done,' end quote. Rick Schoenfeld, quote, 'I was immature, I was the follower, and I made an extremely stupid decision here,' end quote. Woods, quote, 'It was just a lot of pain and suffering we put everybody through that we didn't realize we were doing at the time. By now, I just hope that everyone is going on with their lives. Everything can be somewhat back to normal,' end quote. Yeah, things aren't back to normal for those kids. They'll never be back to normal. And you will also notice the lack of care from Woods. He never really apologized. He's just like, sorry. He didn't even say sorry. It's so offensive.
Yeah.
It's just a total non-apology, and it's really insulting to the survivors. I hope Woods dies in prison. I don't think he should get to enjoy the wealth he used to get more wealth by kidnapping a bus full of children, right? It just makes me salty. His lawyers dispute it, but some estimate that Woods' trust is in excess of $100 million. And the kids he tortured got enough just to pay for therapy? It just makes me so angry. Here are the names of the survivors of the Chowchilla Kidnapping: Edward Ray, Lisa and Monica Artery, Lisa Barletta, Jeff and Jennifer Brown, Irene, Julie, Linda, and Stella Carejo, Johnny Estabrook, Andres and Robert Gonzalez, Jody Heffington, Cheryl Hinesley, Mike Marshall, Jody Matheny, Barbara Parker, Andrea and Larry Park, Judy and Becky Reynolds, Angela and Michelle Robison, Cindy Van Hoff, and Laura Yazzie. I'm sorry if I have mispronounced anyone's name. Fred Woods will be eligible for parole again in 2024, and that's where we are now. That is the story of the Chowchilla school bus kidnapping.
Yeah. I'm still trying to comprehend and wrap my mind around the fact that they didn't get more money.
I know. I'm really upset that they didn't get more money.
You can't do anything if the perpetrator, if the kidnapper, if the murderer doesn't have any money, which happens most of the time. But here, this guy's clearly more than wealthy, and they don't get anything.
Well, you look at the O.J. Simpson and the Brown and Goldman families. They've never seen a penny still, I don't think. It's bizarre. So, yeah.
All right, guys. I think that's it. Thank you, Annie. That was such a great two-parter. I'm kind of mad still, but you know how it is.
I know.
What else is there to say? If you want to write us an email or contact us in any way for whatever reason, please go to our webpage, freshhellpodcast.com. There you find a link to our email, which is freshhellpodcast@gmail.com. Or you find a link to Instagram where you can send us a message, or you can send us a message on Facebook, which is not the most reliable method though, because it kind of goes in a very hidden folder if we're not friends. But please contact us. We read all the messages, actually. You also find links to our merch store, links to our PO box, links to our Patreon. You also find Patreon direct on their webpage, which is patreon.com. Annie, would you explain the podcast award situation?
Yes, so we are finalists in the People's Choice Podcast Awards, which is very exciting. We never thought that would happen, and we are in both the category of true crime and best female hosted. And so a while ago, we asked you to vote for us. That was the first slate of voting. So if you did that, thank you very much. And if you did that last month or two ago, you may receive an email. Please check for another email from the Podcast Award people, because they choose randomly 10,000 of the people who voted in the first round. And those are the only people who are allowed to vote in the second round, which I think is how they keep it from becoming a bot situation. Like, you have to be invited back to vote. So if you got one of those emails, we would so appreciate it if you took another minute to just vote for us in true crime or best female hosted or both, whatever you feel is appropriate. We would so appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I think that's it. I think the last thing that I need to tell you is tell your pets we said hi. The cute ones, the ugly ones, the scaly ones, the ones that have more legs than I would like them to have. Treat them kindly. Treat them the best way possible. Also treat your fellow human beings kindly. Give them the benefit of the doubt if they say something. Ask them, what did you mean? And then, if they're assholes, yeah, fuck them.
Yeah, definitely.
And that's it.
Yeah, that's all for this week. If you yourself are going through hell,
keep going. Tschüss.
Bye.